Hey, this is Shane, and welcome to my Curator of the Lost Stories podcast. Today's episode is called Are Cashews a Nut? I hope you enjoy it. I have to admit something. When I'm out and about, I listen to people's conversations. I don't intentionally eavesdrop. I don't try to pry. I don't deliberately try to hear things. But when someone is saying certain words or snippets of phrases, they'll just catch my attention. And then I can't help but hearing the conversation. This happened a couple of days ago at the library, and there were two elderly ladies at the counter, and they were having a conversation, and I couldn't tell you about what. The majority of the time, their voices and discussions were essentially background noise, until out of the blue, their words rang clear as a bell to my listening ear. The conversation went basically like this. Library lady one says, "Would you like a cashew nut?" To which Library Lady 2 said, "Oh, I recently read about cashews. They're really not a nut." The conversation continued with, "Okay, well, would you like a cashew?" "Ah, poor cashews. They're so out of style." "Okay, but do you want one?" "I just remember when everyone liked cashews. Cashews were special." "Do you want one?" "Oh, look how big that one is." "Okay, do you want it?" "Sure, I'll take it." At this point, they changed subjects, and I didn't hear anything else, and the conversation faded back into the background and low-level hum of the library, and, even though the ladies spoke in the same hushed tones of library decorum for the entirety of the conversation, their volume momentarily turned up for me with the mention of cashews. I didn't try to eavesdrop, honest. I didn't try to overhear what they were saying. In fact, I wasn't paying them any attention. But then there was something in that interchange about cashews that captured my ear and imagination. It stayed in my head as I left and I went to my truck, and I found that I was armed with an unexpected mission. I returned home to consult the internet on the pedigree of the cashew. Was it really a nut, or was Library Lady number 2 a practical joker, preying on my listening ear? Sitting down at my computer, typing it in to the Google search bar, I say, "Are cashews nuts?" And immediately, I'm greeted with 14,200,000 results, to include surreal photos, and the bold first search result entitled "Cashews, the nut that is not a nut." This feels like jackpot, and I didn't want to take the headline search for granted, so I dug a little bit deeper, revealing that the status of the cashew is often debated, and it is a bit confusing. In my cursory research, one article stated that botanically, cashews are a master of disguise. They split in half like a legume, but they're not a legume. They look like a nut and grow on a tree, but they're not a tree nut. The so-called cashew apple that they grow on looks like a fruit, but it's not an actual fruit. It turns out that the cashew is a drupe. Dramatic pause here as I just think, damn. I've answered the basic question of, is a cashew a nut? But now I'm drawn into the useless information rabbit hole and more internet searches to determine what is a drupe. Well, it turns out that a drupe refers to stone fruits, like peaches and plums. So a drupe is a fruit that has a soft, fleshy exterior and a pit with a seed inside. Our favorite non-nut, the cashew, is actually the seed inside the pit of a fruit, thus being called a drupe. Well, now being suitably confused, I stop reading as the rabbit hole tries to pull me deeper in with another superfluous and equally enticing search result entitled, "Are walnuts and pecans a drupe or nut?" But I stop there. 15 minutes of my life are already gone, and I'm satisfied with the fact that the cashew's not a nut, but it is instead a drupe, although the exact explanation of a drupe leaves me a bit discontent and a little worse for the wear. When I think about this, I think what really turned me on to this entire existential discussion of nuts was my own memory of cashews. When I think of cashews, I can't help but think of my dad doing crosswords in his recliner in the living room. He always had a small stool beside his chair that always held the paper, the crossword dictionary, a police scanner, and a jar or tin of nuts. The nuts were usually of the Planters brand and were typically plain peanuts or mixed nuts. Every so often, the cheerside nuts would be a whole jar or can of pure, unadulterated cashews. But growing up in the 70s, you didn't buy an entire jar or can of pure cashews. They were intolerably expensive. In fact, a whole jar or can of cashews actually felt like, and for me, they still feel like, a sign of wealth. Instead, you bought mixed nuts, which, based on my newfound knowledge that the cashew is not a nut but a drupe, appears to be a marketing misnomer, if not an absolute error in labeling of a can of mixed nuts. At any rate, when you ate mixed nuts, you would feel especially lucky and savor the handful of salty delight that rewarded you with the presence of a cashew, especially if it was a big, plump, gorgeous, whole cashew and not just a piece of cashew. For me, I think this is the exact opposite response that's elicited when my handful of mixed nuts results with the inclusion of one or more of the oppressive and intimidating Brazil nuts. I am not a fan of the Brazil nut. It's an interesting side note that in 2017, it was reported that supplies of Brazil nuts slumped by more than 2/3 after a catastrophic harvest in the Amazon rainforest due to El Nino. While I'm sure this is terrible news for the South American nut farmer, my distaste for the Brazil nut feels somewhat vindicated by this fateful development. However, an equally disappointing moment occurs when eating mixed nuts when your salty nut pour results in 100% peanut filler. No pecans, no almonds, no hazelnuts, thankfully no Brazil nuts, but definitely no cashews. They're all peanuts. This is truly unsatisfactory. Remember when a mixed nut can would state in big letters, less than 30% peanuts? How reviled is a peanut to be advertised as being less than 30% of a mixed nut conglomerate? Well, when I think of cashews, I think the final thing that always comes to my mind is my Uncle Billy. He's my mom's brother, who I always called Bill Bill. Bill Bill loved cashews and had an uncanny ability of picking every single cashew out of a jar of mixed nuts. 5 minutes with a newly opened jar or container of mixed nuts, and Bill Bill would have every cashew extracted from the mixed nut container. I'm not sure how he did it, because he didn't pour them out and sort through them, remove all the cashews, and dump all the other nuts back into the can. Granted, he could have exercised the principles of granular convection or granular segregation. That's when you have big objects and little objects in a container and you shake it. The big ones come to the top. Interestingly, this is also known as the Brazil nut effect, thus demonstrating why the obnoxious Brazil nut is always on top of the mixed nut can, begging to be eaten first, and likely why I have such distaste for that said Brazil nut. But barring an innate sense and understanding of physics, Bill Bill could have just had a cashew selecting superpower. This is probably a simpler explanation, and by Occam's razor, the likely explanation, because he also had the ability to always get the biggest piece of chicken on his plate at dinner. If only a simple internet search could solve that mystery as well, but today, I'm content with the knowledge that I've gleaned the real nut status of the noble cashew, the nut that is not a nut.